Now let me introduce the keynote speaker. Dr. Freddie Vanden Spiegel is economic advisor at BNP Paribas Fortis Bank. He's also a professor at the Free University in Brussels. He's been a visiting professor to Valeric University in Belgium and to Warsaw University in Poland, as well as several other European and US institutions. Dr. Vanden Spiegel serves as the economic advisor to BNP Paribas Fortis Bank. He actually was the chief economist before switching the role more to the professorial role and more taking on the advising role to the BNP Paribas and Fortis. He served as managing director Belgian, Luxembourg, and French investment funds, board member of Brussels Stock Exchange, trainer for Eastern European bankers and commission, which is commissioned by the European Commission, board member of European Federation of Mutual Funds, chairman of the consultative panel of Committee for European Banking Supervisors, and member of the international or interinstitutional monitoring group sponsored by the European Parliament and European Council. Dr. Vanden Spiegel, the podium is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy that you're all here despite the very nice weather outside, because the subject we are going to discuss here this afternoon is not really a very pleasant subject. It's about crisis. And this crisis which we are talking about is a crisis that is quite special. As economists we are used, and as investors we are used to crisis. It's something that comes and that goes. It's together with the business cycle. You know, the 7 fat years, the easy years, and then followed by 7 meager or difficult years. It's the normal human cycle of behavior, but this crisis is totally different. And what I would like to do in the next 30 minutes is, first of all, start with the big picture, asking the question, why is this crisis now so different from all the others? And then we are going to the second point that I would like to discuss with you, and that is what is now specific for Europe about this crisis, because despite the fact that the crisis started in the US, the effects on Europe seem to be more important than on the US in the meantime seeming to recover from the crisis. So Europe is in a bad shape, and we are going to see why this could be. And then the third part of my presentation, very briefly, is the consequences of this analysis of this crisis for Europe, for the US, and for the rest of the world. Now, in my mind, first point, why is this crisis so different as all the others? Because normally a crisis is, you get a surprise, you get a downturn of the economy, 3, 6, perhaps 9 months, the economy suffers, you get unemployment, you get all kinds of unpleasant effects, and then after 1 year, automatically it seems to be the invisible hand is leading to recovery, to new hope, and to new bubbles, waiting until the next crash. That's normally the cycle of economic growth and of the financial markets. But this time it's totally different. And why? Well, I think it is different because this crisis is the result of a changing world. And what is the world that changed? Well, it is the world design, the model along which the world was designed since the Second World War. This is history, of course, but it's always, if you try to understand what's happening today and try to have an idea what could happen tomorrow, it's interesting to look at the past. If you look at history before the Second World War, Europe, and essentially the United Kingdom, was the dominating economy. The international reserve currency was pound sterling. And with the colonies, the United Kingdom was really ruling the world. And then you get one World War for 1940, 1918. You get the Second World War, 1940, 1945, essentially European wars, but where the rest of the world was also involved. And after 1945, Europe has destroyed itself very successfully. And at that time, as in history all the time, when one major power is destroyed, a new power takes over, and this time it was, of course, the emerging economy of that time, the United States. From 1945, we see the world dominated by the US from a financial, economic, military point of view. The world reserve currency becomes the dollar, and we see all the major international institutions coming to this side of the Atlantic, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations. So the world becomes a United States-dominated world. Now you had, after the Second World War, also another winner of the war, and that was Mr. Stalin of the communist regime in Russia. And he did not appreciate how the US would have or prefer to organize the world, so he said, I'm going to isolate my part of the world in agreement with the US, Treaty of Yalta, and they split the world in two nice parts, the communist world and the free West. And Western Europe was happily under the umbrella of the US. Central Europe and Eastern Europe came under the umbrella of the communist regime, and you get an iron curtain in the middle of Europe. Now this was the model, and we had then, if we talk about the world and the free world, well, we are talking until the 1980s about 800 million people. North America, Western Europe and Japan. And 5 billion people are not considered to be part of the free world. They are all or communists behind the Iron Curtain, or underdeveloped, the old colonies of Europe that have been liberated. So that's the world order until the 80s. And then the world changes. And it changes because of two major things that happen. And always the world economy over 5,000 years changes when you have this kind of events. And the first event is a technological revolution. It's the same thing as inventing the wheel, or inventing and discovering iron, or inventing navigation, or the steam engine in the 18th century. Each time you have such a major invention, a technological revolution, the world power shifts. Some economies that were strong in the old technology fail, some because they are not able to adapt to the new technology, and some new economies take over. And this happened in the 70s, and the technological revolution is ICT. It's as important as the Industrial Revolution because it is fundamentally changing our whole life. All the products that now we consider to be essential, like mobile phones and GPS and flat screens and digital equipment, 20 years ago they were not even invented. But today they are dominating the world economy. They dominate how we live, they change how we communicate with each other, how we work, they create new products, and that's what changes the world economy. So you have technological revolution, and the consequence is that in a technological revolution you create opportunities. Because from that invention of ICT, as we call it, information and communication technology, you have all opportunities to try out and to find economic products out of this idea. And in such a period you need creative minds. You need people like Bill Gates. 20, 30 years ago, starting with the silly idea, I'm going to build a world of software while there were hardly computers. But you need them, and 20, 30 years later, he's the richest man in the world. You need people who invent Facebook, who invent Google, and in a couple of years they become rich and powerful. Now, for a communist regime, which is centrally planned, you cannot be creative. Centrally planned economies are strong in continuing the past. Building railroads, building highways, that's very easy to plan with good engineers. But developing something out of the blue is impossible. And the last president of the communist regime, Gorbachev, and his advisors were aware of that they were losing power against the West. And Mr. Gorbachev, end of the 80s, says we have to stop here, we have to adapt to the free world, to the free market system. It's more powerful, it's better adapted, and the Iron Curtain falls. And immediately Central Europe becomes Western Europe, and Russia is in the middle of turmoil, and China says we are not going to give up communism, but we are going to combine a strict communist regime with the most free economy, the most liberal economy in the Southwest. in the southeast. A very pragmatic combination. I don't know if Karl Marx would be very happy with that combination, but it's quite successful. And Latin America wants to join, and suddenly the world economy becomes a theater for 6 billion people and no longer for 800 million for the happy few. And the result is that you get, of course, to globalization. Globalization making one integrated world. And that globalization was very positive and effective for everybody. Because on the one hand, we had cheap labor available from China, from Latin America, and cheap labor meant that all the products that from now on we were outsourcing and delocalizing for production to these new countries became cheaper. So there was no inflation. Because there was no inflation, interest rates could come down. Because interest rates came down, all investors were genius. It was very simple. You had to be stupid to lose money. Because what did you have to do to make double-digit returns? Well, if you look, for example, at the interest rate, the red curve here, that's the European interest rate. 10% in 1990, and now we are at 1.5%. So in order to make money, what do you do as an investor? You buy a silly government bond in 1990 with a coupon of 10%. You sell it 2 years later. You have your 2 coupons and a capital gain on your bond. So you have double-digit returns. And in 1992, you buy a new stupid government bond. You have twice your 9% plus a capital gain on your bond. You have double-digit returns. So this was, and then all these CEOs and the asset managers, I was one of them, said that they were geniuses. No, it was the Chinese and cheap labor that helped them to bring the interest rates down. Interest rates down, which means that you have double-digit returns. Problem is, for the whole world, we are now at 1.5%. It cannot come down again with 8%. It's over. The party is over. So this is not a crisis, it's a shift in the world economy. And what we have had then is during 20 years that we enjoyed this party of globalization with win-wins for everybody. Now in the meantime, in this globalization, money became so cheap. China is saving 50% of its GDP, while on average the world is saving 10 to 15%. They say 50%. And all that money coming from China and other countries is flowing over the free world. And Greenspan, the predecessor of Bernanke, the governor of the Fed, already said there is an Asian savings glut. And all that money was invested in our markets to buy our companies, and all that pushed up the prices of all assets. And because all that money was available, interest rates came even more down, and everybody could start to buy houses because of low interest rates. Because everybody could buy houses, housing prices went up, and everybody was rich. Okay, so this was the happy times. Now, if you look then now at the consequences of 20 years of a big party, of course, there is always an unintended consequence. And take here, for example, the US, the current account of the US. Since the start of the big party, which Mr. Bernanke today calls the big moderation, it's very strange, but this is the big party, the US gets into a structural current account deficit. Structural current account deficit that is financed by printing dollars. And then someone has to accumulate the dollars. Who is then accumulating the dollars? That is the debt of the US. According to the Federal Reserve, minus $8,000 billion. 8,000 billion. Who is now accumulating all these dollars? Well, here you see the new candidates to accumulate dollars. Is the Chinese central bank. They sit on a pile starting from zero in 1990, and now they have about $2,500 billion in their central bank. So the big owner of all the debt of the US, and also of Europe, because for Europe there are no similar statistics available, but the situation is the same, is China, and it's not only China, is the new world. This is a problem. Now, you see at the same time the financial sector growing like hell. This is financial leverage. Because of low interest rates, because everything goes up, banks become huge, and everybody makes profit. So all the brilliant minds of universities want to work in a bank because there you have big bonuses. And the banking sector is growing and growing, over-leveraged, ready to collapse. This is what happened over these 20 years. And then finally, the world, the planet, is giving us the sign that probably if all citizens in the world, 6 billion, all want to have cars and airco, that then there's not oil enough for everybody. The global warming debate starts and the oil prices go through the roof, and that ends the final story. And then we get the trigger, oil prices go up, suddenly inflation comes back, interest rates go up, and it starts with the housing market in the US that collapses. And this is now the crisis. So this is not a normal crisis, but it's a crisis that started in 2007 and that is now gradually leading to a regime switch. 2007, mortgages, the subprime mortgages in the US, 2008, banks worldwide, 2009, recession worldwide, 2010, we see the first sovereign risk, countries go bankrupt, no longer exotic countries in Latin America or the Far East, no, it are OECD countries, highly industrialized like Iceland, Ireland, and all the others. And then by 2011, we have started asking questions about the Europe and the future of the euro. By 2012, it becomes critical for Europe. So this is the framework in which we have to look at the crisis that we are living today. Now, what is now so specific for Europe? Well, it are three types of weaknesses. The first weakness is the political weakness of Europe. Political weakness because Europe is so complicated. Europeans have made a very complicated thing out of Europe. It started very easily in the 50s as a group of 6 countries under the pressure or inspiration of the US to bring 2 sectors, coal and steel, energy and steel, to a supranational level. Very easy. And then out of that idea in the early 50s came then a couple of years later the idea, shouldn't we enlarge the supranational level, not only coal and steel, but all economic aspects, and we create the European Economic Community. And then after some years, from 6 we go to 9, from 9 to 11 countries. The colonels in Greece, which was a dictatorship at that time, leave the country, and Greece becomes part of Europe. Spain, with the last dictatorships of Europe, Salazar and Franco in Portugal and Spain, leave the country and they come to Europe. Then the Iron Curtain falls and all Central European countries come to Europe. And now we are with 27. From 6 to 27. From only coal and steel to all aspects of life, because now it's not a union, it's not anymore a community, it's a union, even a monetary union. And there are new candidates waiting to get in. All these very fancy countries in the Balkan, well, they are all waiting. They are in the queuing line to get into the European Union. Nobody in Europe understands anymore who is member and what is the quality of his membership. Some are in the monetary union, some are in the economic union, some are in the political union, some are in the economic area, and all these diplomats and these politicians are discussing in Brussels, which becomes a kind of a center of Europe. Now the US has also had this kind of problems in the late 18th century, the times of Hamilton and Jefferson, asking what is now the role of the federal state and what is the role of the state, and how is the sovereignty of the states going to be organized in a coherent way with the power of the federal state. And it was even leading to a civil war, which you also certainly remember, until 1865. So this process of building a united continent is something that is always painful and at risk. And it's a very diverse, here you see the 27 member states. You have member states where the income per capita is 50,000 euro, and you have member states like Bulgaria where it's only 5,000 euro. And it's all in that same union, extremely complicated to manage. Now, if you look at the result of that union, GDP growth, it's not too bad. Despite all the pessimism of Europe, it's quite good. 2%, and on average it's a little bit lower than the US, but the US is a young economy with a growing population, while Europe is a little bit aging already, so it's not so terribly difficult or different, the result of this all. But it's extremely pessimistic. This is consumer confidence in Europe. When you ask to European households, what do you think of your situation in 3 months? Well, if you are at 0, they say more or less the same. You see over 40 years, they're always saying bad, worse. Only 2 times in the 40 years they said perhaps it could remain the same, and that was always the start of a crisis. So we should be happy when Europeans are pessimistic. Okay. Now, the result of all this is that in that political debate that was changing all the time, that Europe did not have the courage to build a federal political union. And that Europe is still 27 countries which all are sovereign. And for this crisis, this was a huge problem, because the result was that when the crisis hit us, we did not know what to do. Each country tried to find solutions individually. There was no structure centrally. There was no power centrally. There was no money centrally. There was hardly a central bank, but that in the Treaty of Maastricht had a very strict role and could not do what the Federal Reserve, for example, could easily do in the US. So Europe was not prepared. The political problem and weakness of Europe. The second weakness is the economic weakness. And the economic weakness is that if you look at the consolidated level of Europe, it's not too bad. Europe and the Eurozone, they do, on average, on the long term, not so bad, certainly not in comparison with the US. China and the other countries, it's another story, of course. Government debt, yes, is going up, but not like the US. It's under control because there's discipline in Europe. If you look at the competitiveness, the current account, it's a balance. It's a perfect economy, which is competitive. So it's all very nice. But it's very nice at the consolidated level, but not if we go back to the country-by-country level. And each country over the last 10, 20 years has chosen other politics. Some countries, like yearly see the statistics of 2 years ago, because economists tend to have a very short memory. When then you got to the analysts like Capital Economics, a very famous consulting firm, they said the champions of Europe in growth are number 1, Greece, number 2, Spain, number 3, Ireland. And the lame ducks are totally at the right, Italy and Germany. The lame ducks. These are the bad economies. 2 years later, you see the world upside down, and that's this crisis. So just to say, don't take care of what economists say. Because 2 years later, the reality is totally the opposite of what they told you. Okay, now, what did Germany do to get growth? Well, they said, Deutsche Gründlichkeit, austerity. We are going to stop increases in salaries. We are going to create flexibility. And the loan costs in Germany did not move over the last 10 years. Other countries, and the result was that they started to be, of course, competitive because salary cost, unit labor cost did not go up. And export starts to grow as the engine of growth for Germany. Germany, for Europe, is little China. What China does with the US, well, Germany is doing the same thing with Greece. Now, the problem is that the agreement between the US and China is stronger than the agreement between Germany and Greece. That's the problem. Because China is buying up all the debt of the US without complaining. Well, Hu Jintao sometimes said that he's not very happy, but he continues to buy all these dollars that Mr. Bernanke is printing. While Germany, Mrs. Merkel, is sitting on her own savings and refuses to give her savings to the Greek who need them. That's the problem, the dilemma of Europe. Now, if we look then other solutions, well, some countries said, let's make our economy grow based on government debt. That's Mr. Obama's solution also for 5 years. Yes, we can, from 60% to 100% debt. The problem is that later on someone has to pay back or go bankrupt. Some countries like Greece, they looked for the government to bring growth, and they are bankrupt. Because they are so big, small, so you're easily bankrupt. If you're bigger, it's difficult. Others said, let's bring more credit to the private households. Facilitate consumer credit. The US did that, and Ireland did that, and Spain did that. And the consequence is that you get housing bubbles. So these are the housing bubbles that then burst. So you have one side of Europe, strong austerity, low-cost Germany with good quality, good prices, and strong in exports, and part of Europe which we call Club Med, all around the Mediterranean, who have other economic models, but which collapsed during the crisis. And the result is that all these other countries, since 10 years, all became incompetitive, a little bit like the US. You have within Europe a huge exporter, that's Germany, and that all was done in 10 years. So this makes me a little bit optimistic. As it was done only in 10 years, it is not a problem of 100 years or of cultures. It's only 10 years ago that these fundamental mistakes were made. So if we could forget about the last 10 years, you don't have these excesses. So we only have to correct the last 10 years, not 20 years, and not going back to the Middle Ages. Because that's now very popular in the Anglo-Saxon analysis of Europe. It's a lost continent, and it's since years, and it's no, it's 10 years where the fundamental errors in economic design were made. And then you see that these weak countries, if you have a scorecard, well, the more you go to the right, the more red cards you get, and you see that some of these countries, everything is red, and that's Greece, that's Ireland, that's a little bit Spain and Italy. Okay, so this is how we got into this huge problem of divergence within Europe, despite all the treaties. And then we have the third, or the second, or the third problem, and the third problem is the banks. Banks in Europe are oversized. They are very big, and you get all the new regulations. Banks in Europe, for example, if you look at their balance sheet to GDP, it's about 300%. If you compare that to the US, banks' balance sheets to GDP are 80 to 90%. It means if banks in Europe and the US have the same problem, that the effect on the economy in Europe is 4 times bigger than the effect in the US, because you have small banks relative to your economy. The US is a typical market-funded economy where corporates and a lot of things are happening through financial markets, and very few things remain on bank balance sheets. In Europe, you have huge bank balance sheets and few markets. And because of these huge bank balance sheets, where you have all these bad assets because of the crisis, these banks suffer and tend to collapse. Here you see, for example, over the last 10 years, the evolution of the loans given to the corporate sector. In the US, it was, from US banks, 1,000 billion in 2000, it's still 1,000 billion. In Europe, it was already 3,000 billion, and it's now 5,000 billion. So these European banks, being so big, are a danger for the economy and for the countries. So that's the third problem of Europe. And the problem is the interconnection between the three. Because Europe is not a federal state, the interconnection is that if a country gets weak, like Greece or Spain, well, by definition, its banks are investing in local government bonds. So by definition, the banks become weak. Then the banks have to be rescued. Who is able to rescue the bank? It's the government of the country, who has then to pay to put more money in the banks. But because it puts more money in the bank, the country weakens. Because it weakens, the banks have more losses. And you get a downward spiral that is very difficult to break. So that's the headache of European politicians nowadays. And here you see the dramatic events of the crisis, where until 2006, one of the countries with the lowest unemployment rate was Spain. And Germany was one of the highest. Germany was at 10%, Spain at 6%. And then the crisis comes, and suddenly unemployment in Germany goes down to 6%. Mrs. Merkel says, I have done it. It's not right. Why is the unemployment in Germany going down during the crisis? Because China has pumped so much money in its economy to build new investments, and for these investments they needed high-tech machinery. So they needed German machinery to build the investment capacity. So it's the Chinese who have rescued Germany. But the Spanish, their housing sector was in collapse, and the only thing they can offer to the international markets and the Chinese are tomatoes and olives. And the Chinese don't want them. So they are the Spanish with all their tomatoes, and Germany is now full employment. Now in Spain you have unemployment of 25%, and in Germany 4%. The question is, can you live with the same currency in 2 such different countries? That's a fundamental question. Well, and then, of course, everybody sees what happens. You have the crisis, and you have all the reactions. And the reactions are, first of all, we are going to rescue Greece. Too late, too little. It has taken too much time, but now it's done. You have a rescue fund solidarity, fiscal solidarity among all the Eurozone countries with about 800 billion euro available to rescue small countries. But it's too late for Greece. Second, you impose austerity on the weak countries. Bad choice, but Mrs. Merkel insisted. So a country like Greece already starving, Mrs. Merkel says austerity. Well, if you're starving, you're not going on diet. And so that country collapses totally, and now you get political problems. And then the third element, which is the most important, but it's not helping for the short term, that's political reform in Europe. And political reform means that in the meantime, last year, everything that has been decided in Brussels is to make from Europe something that gets quite close to the US, with a strong federal state, discipline on the individual member states, and central planned fiscal solidarity. Now, that's all fine, but the problem is there still democratic support for these reforms? And that's something we will find out. We see now in France, Mr. Hollande, what is he going to do? Marine Le Pen in France, almost 20% votes against Europe. We see the same in the Netherlands, we see the same in Finland, we have seen it in the past. Each time that Europe is in crisis, you see that anti-European movement winning, but then until now, each time it has not really led to the debacle of Europe. Okay, so conclusion, this is Europe. Will it get back on the road? I think with what politically has been decided today, it will be back on the road, but it will be difficult and with a lot of political surprises. In the meantime, of course, we have to take into consideration that revolution of the world since the beginning of the crisis. And there, for the Western world, because the crisis is a Western crisis, China has no crisis, Brazil has no crisis, Russia has hardly a crisis, it's the US and Western Europe, and Japan already since 1990. That's where the crisis is. It's not a worldwide crisis. The other countries are prospering. So there we have to find solutions, a new design taking into account the reality of globalization. And the reality means that we cannot continue like this. One country, because it has the world reserve currency, printing dollars to get out of its problem and saying the dollar is my currency and is the problem of the rest of the world. This is a solution that is not possible anymore. And you see already the new countries like China saying we want to not get rid of the dollar, but we want to change the monetary system worldwide. We want to have more influence on the IMF and the World Bank. We want a new design of the world. This is a world that is not sustainable. A number of exporting champions like China, below, and Germany exporting almost as much as China, but China is 1.3 billion people and Germany only 80 million. And then one champion of imports, and that's the US, paying all the imports with dollars that are printed. This cannot continue. So we need solutions for this world, because otherwise we will go from one crisis that destroys the West and weakens the West to another one. We have reached the limits of the model after the Second World War. And this is a huge exercise. In the meantime, the world gets from the illusion and the enthusiasm of globalization, becomes nationalistic, protective, where if you look the Financial Times, it's about trade wars, it's about currency wars, it's about capital controls, Argentina nationalizing companies, it's about who is now, how are we going to stop the Chinese from exporting? Are the Chinese not dumping? Don't we need protection to keep our jobs in our country? So you see back to the world before the 80s, nationalism, protectionism. Even within the European Union, where Spain and Germany are fighting and getting to protectionism. I don't want to make you depressed, but it resembles the 1930s. And if you look at the similarities, you would say we are now in year 4 of the 1930s. Where exactly the same movements from a banking crisis, from a stock market crisis to a banking crisis, to economic crisis, to inflation, deflation, to political reactions, and then to extreme left, extreme right, protectionism, and then we are going further on that, in that direction. So these are the problems of the world. The world is back in the hands of politicians. They have to redesign Europe. They have to bring more jobs in the US. They have to find a new IMF and a new World Bank. and a new world reserve currency. They have to do everything, the politicians. Finish the free markets, because free markets in a lot of minds of politicians have proven that they are not capable to bring equilibrium in our economies and growth. So huge responsibilities. In the meantime, growth in the East continues. Average growth of Europe and the US, 2%. Average growth of Asia, 8 to 10%. And that continues for years. Despite bubbles and despite crisis, it just continues. And you see how the world economy is changing every year in a dramatic way. Last slide, and I have taken too much time, I'm terribly sorry. Last slide. In my mind, what we have seen here is not a crisis, but is a revolution. And I could compare it with the French Revolution, 1789, which was also inspiring Washington and Jefferson and all these big American politicians. Well, the French Revolution in France until 1789, the king was the boss. The citizens had to obey the king, and the church helped the king to make the citizens obey. And then suddenly in 1789, the citizens say, we think we have to change. We think that in our society of the future, the citizens have to decide, the king has to obey or disappear, and the church should be specialized on its core business, bring us all in heaven in our next life, but not in this one. And then you start with the French Revolution, and it takes 30 years. And sometimes the king obeys, and sometimes he disobeys, and he loses his head. And then you try with Napoleon, and then with the Directoire, and then with the Consul, and then with Robespierre, with his guillotine. And after 30 years, you have a new model, a balanced model, where you see a democracy with the parliament, the government, and a future also for religion and church, but in a new balance. This is what the world is looking for. What is the new balance? And the citizens who are today, just like the French in 1789, are saying, we do not want to continue as in the past. Are not the US, is not Western Europe, but is the emerging world. And the good news is that everybody in the G20 is around the table trying to find solutions about banks, about trade deficits, about the world reserve currency, about global warming. The agenda is huge. And if you look at the meetings of the G20 and the declaration, the press conference at the end, you should read that. It always starts with, we, the leaders of the world. We have discussed A, B, C, D, E, etc. And the last paragraph is, and we all agree that we disagree. But we will continue to discuss in 2 months. This is the difficulty, this is the big task where all these politicians are headed to preserve the globalization and all its good things and the free markets, but in a balanced way where every country, every emerging and developed country finds its balanced place. Thank you very much.